Thank you, Cynthia. And thank you, Director Rodriguez, for getting us off on such a good start this morning, and thanks to everyone in the room for coming out today. As Cynthia mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the root causes of crime, beginning with some reflections of what we know about human behavior. So back in 1975, Samaroff and Chandler first introduced the idea that there was some kind of transactional model of human behavior, nature-nurture debate. And then in 1995, a researcher named Giaconia established that many of us are exposed to childhood experiences that are adverse in nature. And many of us are familiar with the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Exposure Study, that now has become famous. But really, for more than 20 years, we now have known that all of us, before the age of 18, have a very high likelihood of having experienced a traumatic effect or a traumatic experience that can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. So these are things, PTSD, which itself is a little more complicated than we sometimes think, but these are experiences that are difficult to cope with. They're not just the run-of-the-mill stressors. Folks that experience 4 or more of these in their lifetime, especially as children, are 4 to 12 times more likely to suffer from chronic diseases like heart disease, depression, and even suicide. And the field of epigenetics is bringing us some fairly profound things to think about. In small mammals, they're now showing that the experience of a grandparent who witnesses what's called toxic stress or a very traumatic experience may have something change in their molecular chemistry at a genetic level that can be passed to future generations. So these studies are showing that a grandchild may exhibit the same stressful behaviors of the grandparent, even though the grandchild did not have the same experience. So if that can be replicated in humans, I think we'd all agree that's a pretty profound thing for us to think about. But simply put, human behavior is a complex mix of self and the settings in which we're in. Much in the same way, the places where we grow up can have long-lasting effects on our behavior and our well-being prospects. Since the Black Report in the 1980s was released, that was really the first report on what we now call social determinants of health. But the evidence continues to grow that social things such as poverty, war, high crime, joblessness, weak ties to formal institutions, and lack of basic resources can actually change our life expectancy, right? The age at which we are expected to die. In the United States, communities that are hardest hit by these issues also have a persistent thread of disparities from race and ethnicity that generations of families have experienced. These things push these communities deeper into the justice system, push children out of school, and oftentimes away from families to spend their lives growing up in foster care. Rob Sampson's work has shown us that even when individuals from these hard-hit communities beat the odds, they go to college, they get a good job, they have a career, on average, they still earn less than their white counterparts. In fact, his most recent follow-up on his original work showed that the median income from the neighborhood you grow up in predicts the median income of where you live as an adult. Basically, there's a persistence to these inequalities that seems to be tied to the neighborhood context we're in, race, and these things can follow us throughout our lives. And then finally, the shared experiences we have together in situations, right, that we have in common with each other may affect our expectations of what we think is normal. Wright and Fagan's work on norms of delinquency showed that youth who live in neighborhoods of what's called concentrated disadvantage, these are places that are impoverished, a lot of single-parent families, joblessness, crime, these young people over-report their own delinquent behavior, even though they may not be engaging in that kind of behavior. But it seems normal to them. And this is similar to research we see around drug abuse and drinking, where on college campuses, students are more likely to report accelerated rates of binge drinking themselves if they believe other students on campus are doing the same. And I mean, we have 20 years of research now showing when you actually have a communications campaign on college campuses that says, here's the actual rate of drinking, self-reported rates also go down. So we're influenced by this collective experience we have together and what we think is going on around us. So what does any of this have to do with urban gun violence, right? Well, that's the question. I'm asking us to consider whether our behavior, violent behavior, is influenced by the places where we grow up, the traumas we and our families have experienced, and the shared histories of our families and our neighbors. While crime in general has been falling in most categories for many years now, and we're very grateful for that, gun violence, especially among older youth, has persisted in cities with high rates of concentrated poverty. Homicide is clustered in these places, where it remains the leading cause of death for Black males ages 15 to 34, and many of those deaths involve guns. For example, Flint, Michigan, 2012, had the highest homicide rate for any city with a population over 100,000 people, and in that same year, it was the second most impoverished city in the country as judged by childhood poverty. My home city of Philadelphia is seeing a 3-year steady increase in homicide rates, and also has to live with the fact that over 12%, or almost 185,000 people, including 60,000 children, live on about $10,000 a year. In these inner cities that experience the most firearms violence, relationships with police are often strained. Communities may feel targeted or even abandoned by the police and the justice system. And the clearance rate for homicides, so the proportion of crimes that are solved, is really low in many of these places, much lower than we might imagine. I've heard residents sit across the table from me when I've interviewed and tell me they're either afraid to speak out because of retaliation, or they're afraid that the police will somehow not believe them and get them implicated. So again, that feeling of either being afraid of those who may shoot them or feeling abandoned by the justice system. In either case, it's the same result. Violence continues and becomes very normalized. However, correlation does not equal causation. Whether or not these things amount to root causes of gun violence is actually still an open question, and will only be answered once funds are made available, as Dr. Rodriguez has said, to study these crucial questions as we would study any other leading cause of death. But it doesn't mean that we're not funding gun violence prevention strategies. We are. So I'd like to go over a little bit of the research there. Perhaps the most common gun violence strategy over the past decade has been what's called focused deterrence. This is a model that works largely in city environments with very high-risk offenders and their communities. These include things like ceasefire, which you may have heard of. They use a combination of de-escalation of the conflict, notifying offenders that the police are going to respond rapidly if violence continues, offering supportive services to offenders through sort of a loose network of resources. When Braga and Weisberg did their most recent systematic review of these strategies, there were mixed results. And this is very common in the gun violence literature. You see decreases at a community level, so you look at community rates of violence and crime, and you see decreases when these interventions are in place. But it's very difficult to tie those to the individuals who are part of these interventions. And that's because the interventions themselves are not studied really well in terms of the implementation of it. So I'm in a program, I was there for 6 weeks, I have sort of a dosage, and now my behavior has changed. So 2 problems: behavior at the individual level is usually not measured in these studies, and my research team has been guilty of the same things. It's very hard to get that data, and it's expensive. And 2, the actual implementation process of the interventions are not usually studied the way we need them to be. But are there alternatives to this model that includes police suppression, considering where we're at in the inner cities and the strained relationships we have with police? Do we have any alternatives that show effectiveness at that community level, but may have more of a focus on well-being and development and the root causes of crime, rather than de-escalating just the conflict in front of us? In Massachusetts in 2010, the Safe and Successful Youth Initiative was launched in 11 cities with the highest per capita gun violence rates. And it's still in place today, even with a changing governor from Democratic to Republican. We believe it's still in place. We've studied this intervention now, it's going on the 7th year, because it shows very promising effects. When we studied the intervention's impact from 2010 to 2013, we found 5.5 fewer victimizations per month in treatment cities. Intervention participants were 40% less likely to be incarcerated than their peers, and the preventative benefits in the 2 largest cities, Boston and Springfield, were about $14 million. The intervention really focuses on the youth, their individual skill set, their mental health well-being, their skills, their relationships with others, including having a positive role model, mentors, case managers, outreach workers, and then environmental changes, opportunities for work and employment. The police are not involved in this intervention. They support it, they collaborate, but they don't have a role to play. So understandably, I'll just close by saying that understandably the criminal justice system focuses on the act of the shooting and wants to stop that. And I can't argue with that. But sustainable prevention efforts are going to depend on more. They're going to depend on our really understanding the individual, the neighborhood, and the social causes, and the root of these crimes, and then having the strategies, the capacities, and the willingness to do something about them. Thank you.